Hi everyone, and welcome to my new episode. As you may have seen in my title, today I will be talking about some tips and tricks regarding watercolor that you may not have heard of before, at least not on YouTube. Now, I will preface this by saying that this is probably not for the extremely experienced watercolorist that's been doing this for ages and tried out everything, but more geared towards the novice, beginner to intermediate watercolor enthusiasts. And since I'm just doing a little bit of testing with you, I will be using up these scraps that I have lying around here since we're not really doing a painting, which is partly due to the fact that I have some wrist problems, as you can see, and that's why I'm doing something really easy today, but that will hopefully still be very useful to you. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is how to create structure in your watercolor paintings without fussing over the details too much, because watercolor is supposed to be quick and fast and see-through and very, how do I describe it? Like very, I guess you leave a surprise element in there. You just do something and you let the paint itself do the rest. And so you need to figure out some ways to create structure that are not tedious and laborious and make your watercolors look overworked, as I tend to do, I admit, but I'm trying to learn. So one of those things that you can do is really, really simple and easy, which is try not to use as much water and try to deliberately leave a little bit of white on your paper. So I will try to emulate this. Now, this can sometimes be easier with cold pressed paper than with hot pressed paper, but the idea is to have your paint dry enough so that some of the white, okay, this is a little bit too dry, some of the white of the paper will still show through, but not in a deliberate manner. I'm leaving out a square here and a triangle there, but just by moving your brush. Okay, this is still a bit too extreme, so I can use a bit more water here to show you the effect, but you can see that as long as I'm not using too much water, we're creating a little bit of texture aided by the texture of the paper itself. I will bring this a little bit closer so you can see what I did here. That it's not one smooth surface that I created, but it has a little bit of interest. And this could help you create landscapes that are not super smooth. You could have natural landscapes with grass and plants. You could also have some kind of an abstract background. You could have a lighting situation that maybe looking at trees, often the light will shine between the leaves. So you could have a situation where you have these white dots in between. And that's a very easy way to recreate that without thinking too much about where to put your dots, where to put your paint, and where to leave white. Now what also helps is to take an old brush. I had one lying around here. Like sometimes old watercolor brushes will lose their tip. This is a very cheap brush that I got from some kind of a hobby store. So this doesn't really qualify as a watercolor brush anyway, even though it was marketed that way. And you can't really do anything with this. So what you can do is take your scissors, and let me just grab something where I can let the trash go, and cut off the tip. Now this depends on how soft your brush is, how much you want to take off. You could take off even less than that until you have a little bit of a stippling kind of brush. The idea behind this is to have more sturdiness in here, because when it's all soft and flowy, it will just create streaks, I guess. And now you have a little bit more structure, and you can use this. You can do that with larger brushes as well, of course. You can use this to create certain effects in a very cheap way. Like, you don't have to buy an expensive stippling brush for this to happen. You can even use a makeup brush for this, no problem at all. You're just going for that structure and that texture, and you're not going for a high quality watercolor brush that points and that can do multiple things. Like I said, you can do that with a makeup brush, and you can also use, I have this huge brush here that I've used for painting jobs, like house painting jobs before. Really inexpensive, but gets the job done, and could also get large surfaces covered with paint in a really quick time. It doesn't always have to be the expensive stuff. So another tip that I have is, when you're drawing complex things, like for example the trees that we mentioned before, and we can stick to the green since we've already put it in our palette. Let's just mix these two. Try not to, like I said, don't overthink it, and try to just imply the structure. Like, don't make everything super structured, sorry. But for example, you can have one part of the tree looking really smooth, and then you have a little part here that's more dotted, implying that there's some light shining through, and so on and so forth. And this doesn't only work for trees, but also for things like brick walls, for example. It's just an example off of my head, really off the top of my head. If we have a brick wall, you don't have, it depends on what you want to achieve and on your subject matter. You don't have to paint each tile separately, but you can also have a smooth large area covered, and then in some spaces you can leave a little bit of white, and just implying that here and there will already be enough to tell your brain, hey, finish this pattern for me. This is supposed to be a brick wall, but I'm not going to do everything here. The other thing you can do is go back into this area and take some of that white off, and I'm sure you've seen that a lot before by absorbing. Sorry, I'm just reaching for my tissues. Oops. Yeah. Live TV here. So by using something absorbent, you can go back in and create, I'm not even thinking about bricks right now, but just any type of texture that you want to put in there by taking off the pigment. And sometimes you can even use the texture of the tissue paper to your advantage, because it has a pattern of its own. Can't really see it very well in this case, but just use things that you have around the house. Make your life easy. Don't always think complicated and think, oh, I have to paint like every dot separately here. I have to do this for hours on end. But just find some easy, simple ways to just hint to, oh, this isn't working. Maybe I need to use more paint in this case to make it more obvious. Hint to the texture that is going on before, instead of doing it exactly as you see it. You can see a little bit here. I hope that my camera is focusing. So you can see that there is a little bit of action going on here, making this area more exciting and more interesting without you having to do it by hand. Pretty simple so far. But there are also some things that as a beginner maybe you have not heard of, which is granulating pigments. Now I will say this is probably not going to be very easy for me to show in this case, because I'm using a palette for beginners, and this palette is student quality and not necessarily artist quality, and I did some research into the pigments. And the thing is that they're pre-mixed in a way that may not be helpful for what I'm trying to show. But if you did more research into your pigments, maybe, unlike me, beforehand, then maybe you've bought some pure pigments. And some of these are known to granulate. One of those pigments, I'll explain that to you in just a minute, but one of those pigments is ultramarine blue, for example. Now my ultramarine blue, for some reason, already is a mixture of ultramarine and Prussian blue. I mean, of the pigments that make up those two. I don't know why they did that. But the idea is, for some pigments, even on their own, if you let them dry, after a while, you'll see some granules in here. Like the pigments are separating from the binder, I guess. I don't know if that's the proper way to explain it. And often it will happen to you involuntarily by mixing two colors that just repel each other. I'm just going to try to do it here. An example of this would be, like I said, ultramarine blue with burnt umber, or with Venetian red. It could be cobalt blue also. It could be sap green with burnt umber, Windsor violet, and raw sienna. You really just have to experiment with the pigments that you have. Just observe how they react to each other and how they interact while they're drying. It's important not to use any agents to speed up drying in this case, like using your blow dryer or something, because you really need to give them the time to do what they want to do. And after a while you will see some sort of a stippling effect. Now, like I said, this is not a great example because my red is a mixture of Venetian red pigment and another pigment, and my ultramarine blue is not pure either. But just try out what you have at home and see if maybe you can get some surprises out of your watercolors that way without putting any work into it. Other methods that you may have seen could be adding salt or sugar to your wash, and they will do something similar, maybe a bit more extreme than the natural granulation that you have in your palettes, in your, what do you call them? Half pans or pans. I've heard that Daniel Smith Ultramarine Blue does this a lot, and then this shade called Moon Glow, I think, by Daniel Smith, and Rose of Ultramarine. Like I said, you would have to do some research into that. It differs from brand to brand, but just look for granulating pigments and you may get that dotty effect, that dusty, starry effects that some people are drawn to. Okay, now you may have heard of underpaintings. If you have ever done an oil painting, or if you've ever done several oil paintings or looked into oil painting a bit more, it's common practice to do an underpainting, to just tie everything together and give it an atmosphere. Like, for example, sienna underpaintings are very popular. Those brownish colors, depending on the mood that you want to achieve, can give the whole thing a warmer look. Now, this may sound counterintuitive for watercolor because it's supposed to be very translucent, but you can use an underpainting for your watercolor if that is easier for you to achieve that atmosphere, because watercolors are layerable. Is that a word? I just invented a word. So you can layer watercolors. It's not necessarily always very popular amongst the more experienced watercolorists, especially if you do too much of it and your colors turn muddy. And it also requires a little bit of knowledge of your pigments, because there are just some colors that are transparent that you can layer very well, and others that are more opaque that you cannot layer, and I will be talking about this in a bit more detail maybe by the end of this video. But just keep it in mind, just as you can make an underpainting for oil, you can also do that for watercolor, as long as you remember not to overdo the layers if you do not want mud. Now, I am somebody who likes muted colors, and I like brownish colors, so sometimes I even like mud a little bit, but I do understand when people say that watercolor is supposed to be very fresh and clean and very minimalistic, so to speak, and that they want their colors to shine and be more luminescent, and that's why you really have to pay attention which pigments you are mixing together. But like I said, that's a video of its own, and I'm not really an expert to tell you too much about it, so I might touch on the subject later on. Now, going back to effects that you can use, something that you can do and that I have not seen, at least not on YouTube, is to make incisions in your paper before you paint. Now, I'm doing this with my dip pen. I'm not sure if this is the best way to do it. You can also do it with any sharp object that you have, or pointed object that you have, like maybe a dried up ballpoint pen or something like that. But let me just create some lines here. Maybe my dip pen isn't strong enough for this, so I'm just going to use my old scissors and try to do the same thing. I mean, I'm just trying to demonstrate the effect in this case. I'm not trying to be artsy or anything. But I put some lines in there now, and now I'm just going to cover it with a layer of paint. I'm going back to orange. Should have used another color, but it doesn't matter. And see what happens if I paint on top of this. Okay. Now this will differ between when you have a lot of water on your brush or very little water on your brush, but you can see here that the pigment is collecting in those ridges that I created. And this can be an alternative to drawing lines. Like if you want to bring out more details or even just texture, you don't have to go back in later on with like a colored pencil, as I like to do, and paint stuff in here, but you can already determine where those lines will be before you put down your watercolor. And I will hold this up a little bit closer so that you can see, hopefully. Can you see these lines where it collected? And it worked better with my scissors than with my dip pen. And I think in this case it's also due to, it depends on how your paper's sized as well. So they add gelatin to watercolor paper. And some paper is sized from within as well. Some of it is only sized on top. So you're really disturbing that upper layer, that protective layer up there, and you're exposing the fibers, the wood fibers, or the cotton fibers in the case of high quality watercolor paper. And you're allowing the pigments to settle in there. You can even see it with a light color like yellow. Can you see those waves? I should stand up and see if I'm holding this the right way. Oops. Okay, I should hold it like that. So you can see this wavy texture that I have. And you can use this in multiple ways. Just use your imagination. But I feel that these things are good to know just as little tools to help you along. Now, I've talked about texture for quite some time, and this next point will kind of tie into texture because you can create textures with it, but its main use is to create highlights. And I'm talking about lifting a little bit of pigment to make something white or more white or lighter again. And they're the classic things that you've seen, like using masking fluid. I myself have a masking pen, in this case a masking marker with masking fluid in it. You can use gum arabic solution or binder, which has a different effect. You can use masking tape to cover parts of your paper up, and so on and so forth. But today I'm trying to present to you some more unusual ways of using household objects, really, to create some highlight. So I'm going to start off with something that most of you should have at home, which is Vaseline. I'm not even sure if everybody has it at home, but that used to be the case. I personally don't like using it for personal hygiene that much because it's a petroleum derivative, but sometimes it just really does the job really well. So most of you should have it, and if not, you should be able to get it. And even if you don't have Vaseline around, maybe you can find mineral oil or some substitute. So I'm dabbing the Vaseline onto my cotton here, and I'm just going to blot this onto my paper. And in this case, I don't even have to let it dry because it's not going to dry anyway. And I'll just leave it for now and move on to the next thing. Where did I put my candle? I was going to show, I'll get the candle later because the candle does a similar thing to this. I also have other stuff like the Swiss knife that I'm going to use. If you have an Exacto knife, that's even better. Ugh, let me see. I usually use this to tear off the sheets from my watercolor block. Okay, I'll just stick to the first one. I think this was still the best one. An Exacto knife would do better than this. I'll have to try and find my Exacto knife in this mess. There's also alcohol that you can use, which I will be putting in this little container and using a dropper to get on my paper. And there's also this little tablet here, which is a disinfecting tablet, and it's okay, it says troclosine sodium. I was kind of expecting a hypochlorite here, a bleaching agent. So I'm not even sure if this is going to work, but if you can find one of those bleaching or disinfecting tablets that used to be, or still are, I don't know, sold to disinfect baby bottles and things like that, then this may be very interesting for you. Give me just a second to get my candle and my alcohol. Okay, got my alcohol and my candle, so we can move on. Now, you can take any kind of candle, it doesn't really matter, as long as you can. It's probably best to use a white one, but other than that, if you don't want any colors rubbing off onto your paper, use white. But other than that, it doesn't really make a difference. Any quality will do. So let's just imagine we're trying to paint, for example, a wall that looks very porous and has a lot of holes in it, or maybe some splashing water where you can see a little bit of foam. So you want those white dots in between, and that's why I'm running the candle over my paper. And now I will be using my brush to just put a wash on top of this and see what happens. So I'm going to use blue for fun this time. And this is my weird Prussian blue mixture that I have, which is ultramarine and Prussian blue, I think. I don't know. Anyway, Now I will be honest with you, I do not want to get any Vaseline on my brush, so I'm going to use maybe the inexpensive thing that I just cut off. Or maybe I can find an like very cheap acrylic brush, like this one. And try to use that, because once I have the Vaseline on my good brush, it's probably not going to be easy to get off. So let's just try this. I'm going to use my cheapo plastic acrylic paint, craft paint thingy, and try to go over the area that I covered with Vaseline just a minute ago. And as you can see, the fat, can I call it fat? The petroleum jelly is repelling the paint quite well, and it's doing so in a soft manner, I would say. Like, you don't have hard edges as you would have them with masking fluid. And I can imagine this being used for clouds, for example. So there's that. And now let's see what happens in the area where I have my candle. Do pay attention to my technique here, because there is no technique to speak of. But the effect is what counts. Should I make it a bit darker to make it more obvious? Now this will totally depend on how hard you press down your candle and on the structure of your paper. So the more structure you have in there in the first place, the more this will show. And let me just darken my pigment a little bit, so maybe it'll be more obvious. Ah, now it's showing a bit better. So as you can see here, shows better with darker pigments or more pigment. The candle is creating a texture as well. It's just displaying the texture of the paper, but it just doesn't give the watercolor to sink into those God, I'm really having problems with my English today. Elevated areas. I guess everything that's elevated has been covered in wax, more or less, and that's why it's remaining quite light. And the valleys, let's just say the mountains, are lighter and the valleys are darker. I will try to do this again in this little space that I have left here and just add more wax and see how that goes, if that makes a difference, because right now it's not as obvious as I would like it to be. Okay, you can see it a bit better now, I think. So you can see these spots where the paper is repelling my paint, and it's also giving it a very haphazard, very natural, organic kind of structure. Now this is a very small area, so if you want to do a large area and you're painting this way, just do a couple of tests beforehand to figure out how hard you have to press with a candle and what the effect will look like. But this is also a super easy way to create structure without fussing too much and without I don't know, trying to manipulate your masking fluid in a way that makes it look more organic and less harsh. So we've done some of those highlight ideas. I think it's time to move on to those that you do after your wash. So putting marks on your paper before you paint is not the only way to preserve the white of your paper, but you can also bring it back after you paint with some tips and tricks. Now, some of these will require a dry surface, and some of them will prefer a surface that's still a bit wet. So now I'm going to work with this surface that still has some wetness in it. And I'm going to use my alcohol for starters. I'm using isopropanol, so nothing really expensive or fancy here. I'm just going to pour it into my little cup. Whoops. It's going everywhere, but not into the cup, of course. Let me close that again. And then I'm going to use my dropper just to see what will happen once I drop. Of course, the paper is bulging now. If I drop this onto my paint, let's do another one. Ooh, can you see that? So it's creating a halo, so to say. This could be a moon or just some abstract structure, but you can also do more stuff with your alcohol. You could fill it into a fountain pen, or I will try to use this with my dip pen, but before I do that, I just want to make this area a bit darker to make it a little more obvious for you what's going on here. Because it's harder to tell when the layer of paint is so light. Now you've heard of things like natural sponges and things like that. It's already too dry for that. Okay, let's just move on with our alcohol. I will try to dip my dip pen in here, and I've never done this before, so let's see if this will work, and try to write with this. Let's see what happens. Okay, right now nothing is happening, but I'm also using a very, very small tip, so that might not be a win. Okay, you have to use alcohol while your paint is still wet, at least a little wet. And you can use, I can imagine that you could even use a little match or a toothpick or any pointed object that absorbs a little bit of the alcohol, but it's also disappearing here. Okay, you need a lot of alcohol for this, so dip something in that will soak up some of that fluid, like maybe a toothpick. I think a toothpick would be great, or a match. Unfortunately, do I have any wooden object? Oh, I even have one used match here. Let's see what will happen if I dip this into my alcohol. The first one was the best. And do this. We are creating highlights. The question is just, will they remain there? And if this fails, we might as well just take a small brush. Take a tiny brush, dip it in your alcohol, and paint a little bit. This is already too dry, see? Now there is something happening here. Not as prominent as it was before, but alcohol definitely dissolves some of that pigment. Okay, you have to do this while it's wet. Let's try something else, which is my little tablet here. And it's, I'm not sure if that's the right kind of disinfecting tablet because I hadn't looked at the name of this before. But let's just make some crumbs here. Ooh, definitely smells like chlorine. So I'm optimistic about this. Just get a little bit. Maybe I can even do that on top of the wash. Let's make a wash first and then see. Don't inhale this stuff. Let's do red. Now, some more water. Oh gosh, the smell of this. I don't know. I think some people even enjoy the smell of these kinds of things like chlorine cleaning agents, but I don't. It's So I could, for example, use my stippling brush with the stuff that I have in here. Oh, it is highlighting very, very gently. So, but there is something happening. Let's try to get some pure tablet onto this with the knife. Okay, got some crumbs on there. And let's just wait and see what happens. And I imagine that this is going to be similar to salt. Now, another thing you can do if your paint is dry already, and this is something that many people don't think of when they're starting out with watercolor, is that you can actually manipulate the layers after you've laid down the color, because some pigments lift quite well even after drying, and this also requires some research on your part, or at least reading the labels of your watercolors before you use them. So what you can do if you want to add another wash on top of this, but you want it to be very flowy and very, I don't know, watercolor-like, I guess, you can re-wet this. There's nothing wrong with re-wetting a layer if you want more softness in there and no hard edges. It doesn't always have to be wet on wet or wet on dry. You can also turn wet on dry into wet on re-wetted. And it works just the same way. Let's go in there with my red. And you can see the color is really flowing. But what you can also do is lift color with this method, and you can also create like a little stencil for yourself. I'm just using a paper stencil. Cardboard would probably be better. Anything important written on here? No. Let's just cut out some kind of a circle or shape, or it doesn't even matter. I'm just trying to show this to you. So here's my stencil, and then I will grab a piece of cloth. And this is fun if you want like specific shapes, like leaves or stuff taken out of your layer to give it a very specific structure. You take your cloth and you wipe away what you have done before. Dabbing is probably better than rubbing if you don't want to damage the surface, but I mean, if you're not going to do another layer on top of this, there's not much you can damage really. And you can already tell it's lighter, and if I take this off now, we have this little shape, which I admit is not very crisp right now because I am not using cardboard, but it could look more crisp if you paid more attention to what you were doing. Let's try this again. Let's just use a piece of watercolor paper. And it doesn't even have to be a negative. You can also maybe dab around this and then have the part around your rectangle be very light. Let's just use the sponge for this one. Might be easier, I don't know. Oops, I'm making a mess. Gosh. I have some alcohol on there as well, so I'm not sure this is going to work the way I'm expecting it. But you get the idea. The idea is simply to take off pigment after drying with a wet cloth or wet sponge and leave something. You know, I want to do more of that. Let me just grab a regular tissue paper to make it a bit more obvious. And I know this is no beauty, but I just want you to understand the idea behind it so you can employ it in your own genius way that's going to look much better than what I'm doing right here. Okay, let's see. Ta-da! Okay, you can see an implication of a square here. And for some reason, some of the paint came off. I think it wasn't completely dry yet, but I think if you let it dry better, it's probably going to be even more obvious. But I believe that this could make for some really, really interesting effects, maybe underwater effects, or maybe just some abstract decorative elements in there. Just something to keep in mind. Now let's see what happened here where I put my, oops, this isn't dry yet, where I put my disinfecting tablet. This didn't do much. I believe that this might not be the right type of stuff here that I'm using, because it's supposed to bleach more than that. It did bleach a little bit here. Maybe I just have to use more. And it seems that there are some bubbles forming, so something is happening. Some kind of an oxidation, or I don't know. I would have to ask my husband, who's a chemist. But I think it's oxidation. Let's just leave that and come back to it in a minute. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is that if you have an Exacto knife, you can go into your already painted works and just scratch out some of that color. Of course, this is not working very well right now. I think an Exacto knife will work better because it's simply sharper, but it is working. You have to practice this a couple of times just to get the amount of pressure right. But I might use a pin instead of the knife. So use something sharp. If you don't have an Exacto knife, get another sharp knife, and let me just try if this pin will do the same thing here. Oh yeah, it takes a little bit of pressure, but I can totally see how I could use this, for example, for grass. If this were green, then I could imply the presence of some grass here, or whatever you want to show. Or maybe just make the surface a bit more scratchy and grungy and uneven, like that. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see the scratches here? It's definitely more interesting than just a plain wash, and there's a little bit going on here. So this definitely takes a little bit of experimentation and trial and error on your part to get the effect that you desire. Now this will ruin the surface of your paper, so only do this as a last step if you don't want to do anything else. But you can see what I did here.